Welcome to the book launch discussion on the occasion of a book launch that we are having here of the DIE-EADI book on building development studies for the new millennium. You will have seen a copy at the entrance. And just to get an idea of how many of you have read the book, could you show hands of who knows the book already or has seen the book? The contributors have, that's good. It is a very a broad approach to redefining development studies, which in itself already is a very diverse topic, and it always was a very diverse topic with different facets. Now this book looks at changing dynamics, changing topics, changing themes with the new millennium, and what this means for research and development and for training and development. As it is an DIE-EADI book, that does very much make sense. And it gives a whole spectrum of topics. Now, we don't want to discuss the entire book tonight. We can always relate on aspects, and there are lots of points we could discuss with it. What we have taken this evening or this afternoon is a discussion on environment and transformation specifically. So taking the thematic angle. Interestingly, the environment is put in the book under challenging themes for development studies, so we'll probably hear more on that. And the transformation perspective obviously is something that keeps all of us interested and busy, and is a challenge to all of us that we can discuss a bit more. We have two speakers here, two contributors to the book, who present on their respective perspectives and chapters, but go beyond the chapter as well. So we have a discussion much more on the development studies and what it means for development studies. The first speaker is Joyeeta Gupta from the University of Amsterdam, working at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. Trained as a lawyer, interesting as a background. And she has contributed to the book a perspective on inclusive development in development studies and what that means in the Anthropocene. I've just learned that you go a bit beyond that topic that we discuss in a broader sense. The second to speak then is Imme Scholz, who is the acting director of the Institute. You probably all know her. She's, as she always emphasizes, you emphasize that, I normally don't, but you emphasize as the longest serving staff member of DIE, trained as a sociologist, and Imme has contributed the chapter on the relevance of environmental research for development studies. We're going to have presentations by the two of them, one after the other, and then we engage in a discussion jointly. So Joyeeta, floor is yours.
I'm going to talk about an inclusive development perspective on development studies in the Anthropocene, and thank you very much for coming. I've also given it a slightly different touch because I just finished chairing the Global Environment Outlook 6, Healthy Planet, Healthy People, and so I have taken some of the insights from this report also to discuss this story. So, what I will present to you today is something about how the Anthropocene changes the context of international development studies, how, as social scientists, I think we should not only critique the Anthropocene, but we should engage with it and claim it and reshape it. I also feel that the SDGs are changing the context of development studies scholarship. Then I talk a little bit about approaches and move on to some challenges. So, if I look at the Anthropocene and how it changes the context of international development studies, let me give you some of the latest data that comes out from our report, where we talk about the fact that the Earth is becoming increasingly unhealthy. And what you can see is that whichever system you take, whether it's air, biodiversity, oceans, land, or water, each of these systems is increasingly being affected by the way we live and the way we function. And in the air system, it's the rising urban air pollution, which affects developing countries as well. It's indoor-rural pollution, especially in the rural areas of the developing world, increasing temperatures, climate change, and of course, persistent organic pollutants, and ozone-depleting substances. If you look at the biodiversity issue, scientists are scared that we are entering the 6th mass extinction event, and 10 out of 14 of the terrestrial ecosystems are in trouble. The global fish stocks are in trouble. The pollinators are in trouble. And at the same time, when you look at who's actually looking after these systems, then you'll find that it's 22% of the global population, which is the indigenous people and local communities, who are actively looking after 80% of the global biodiversity. If you look at the role of women smallholders in the global south, they're the ones that protect the seeds. So they're actually your seed banks of the south in many ways. So these are the communities that are protecting the lands and also being affected by the loss of pollinators, for example. In the oceans arena, coral bleaching, declining fisheries, ocean acidification, marine pollution, sand mining is a new problem that's coming up, and of course the plastics. And in land, it's of course degradation, deforestation, land use change, chemical pollution. Maybe I should just stop here and say that about 100,000 chemicals are in use today, and less than half have been analyzed for their impacts on human health. And then of course you have water, challenges like droughts, floods, extraction of groundwater, the sinking of land as a result, and chemical and biological pollution. And what I try to do in this particular diagram is to show you what is called a burning embers figure about the impacts on the health of the planet and the impacts on human health. And what you can see over here in the lines, which are from green to red, that's showing you the impact on the environmental systems and how irreversible it has become. And the blue to black are the impacts on human health. And what you can see essentially is that perhaps biodiversity is the worst and most irreversibly affected system, followed by air pollution, which includes a combination of urban, rural, and climate change, followed by the oceans, because the changes in the oceans are irreversible. So that's the third worst affected system, followed by fresh water and then land. But then if you look at how does this affect human health, then it is the air pollution problem that perhaps has the most impact on human health, followed by fresh water, followed by biodiversity and the rise of zoonotic diseases, which has about 60% of infectious disease, followed by the oceans because of people's dependence on fish as cheap protein, followed by land. So there's a very close relationship with the degradation of the environment with that of people's health. And so in the context of the Anthropocene, there are a few things that are really important for development studies. First, there are limits to the use of the environment, whether it's at the global level or at the local level. Second, 70% of the world's poorest people depend directly on the environment. And most of these poor people are also looking after the environment. And at the same time, water-related challenges are causing large-scale displacement of people in the millions. In some years, the displacement from environmental problems are greater than that from civil war. A third point over here is that the powerful, they create the rules, they benefit from it, and they externalize the damage it caused. And sometimes we are not even aware how powerful we are, because we often just calculate our own footprints, how much we eat and how much may be resulting from our consumption, but we don't look at how much our savings and our investments and our pensions do to the global environment. And therefore, there's also need for multi-level engagement, not just helping the poorest, but also fighting the concentration of power and the use of transdisciplinary knowledge. So in social science literature, what we find is that there's a huge critique building up of the Anthropocene. People who criticize the Anthropocene argue that it focuses on averages, trends. It talks about the global. It talks about the future. It talks about humanity. It talks about urgency. But all these things are problematic because the averages hide details, the global obscures the local, the future ignores past and present, urgency legitimizes technocratic decisions. People are also angry because of the focus on action and not the underlying discourses, because we talk about limits, without talking about how we need to redistribute, because we tend to try to depoliticize the discussion, because we still focus on growth and not well-being, and because the Anthropocene is supposed to be a visionary and big story, but not modest enough to deal with small-scale issues. And it's basically coming from the natural sciences and positivist world. And I think that we as social scientists have to claim the Anthropocene, and we have to give it a different shape. We have to give it the details. We have to bring the local into it. We have to bring the past and the present. We have to humanize the notion of humanity. And we have to guarantee that urgency does not compromise democratic decisions. The SDGs also changed the context, and they changed the context because I think it's no longer legitimate for us as social scientists to only focus on social issues without taking ecological dimensions into account. But that also means that we can demand from the environmentalists that they also take the social aspects into account. So we have these double roles. And putting the last first requires a completely different way of thinking than leaving no one behind. So how do we get to that way of thinking? If you look at this recent book that has come out called Putting the $1 Trillion Shift, it's about how business is going to solve the SDG problems or achieve the SDG goals. If you really look at it very closely, they look at creating jobs, but they don't really look at solving inequality or addressing poverty or addressing issues of gender aspects. And the poorest people on the earth are the invisible people. So people, the richer elements of the poorer communities are more assertive, are more able to ask for their rights, but the poorest are more difficult to reach. What kind of approaches do we need? Well, in the natural scientists, there's been a whole discussion about the concept of post-normal approaches, and I'm now going to apply it to international development studies. Post-normal approaches are necessary, the authors argue, when you have urgent decisions to address irreversible ecological damage and when society disputes about how to achieve these goals. And normally, in normal science, that's the traditional scope of positivist science, you try to do replicable work. Then you go on to professional consultancy, and in post-normal science, what you try to do is to engage public in discussions about how to address these issues, but you need to keep certain elements fixed. You need to make sure that your constitutional values of society are not destroyed as a consequence. Now, we define inclusive development as having three components in the Anthropocene, having an ecological, a social, and a relational component. In the ecological component, we think there are some hard limits to resources. For example, land is limited. We think that some components have to have soft limits. They need to be negotiated. So we have more than enough CO2 carbon because we have enough coal and oil and gas, but we need to negotiate targets for how much we can take out from under the ground. In terms of social issues, we need to look at how do we address issues that exacerbate vulnerabilities and how do we address issues of extreme wealth. In terms of relational, how do we address the problems of the lean state in terms of, and also how do we affect the imbalance in power affecting politics. And what you find is because there are limits, rich people want to monopolize or divide. So that what happens is they think if there's limited land or limited water or limited resources, whether it's phosphorus or whatever, then you can monopolize that either through privatization or through securitization or through national hegemonic approaches or simply through technology. You can create a technology that helps you monopolize a resource. On the other hand, perhaps a social and relational approach that we need is something that focuses much more on sharing, and I would argue that the sharing storyline is what is most important. And basically, in a sharing storyline, you would have ecosystem limits to use, but you would then share those new limits. You would treat biodiversity and ecosystem services as global public goods and create a strong role for the state in addressing that. You would focus on human rights and constitutional protections. You would go for tax justice, address concentration of wealth, enhance multilateralism, look for discursive politics, and try to address the securitization of limited resources. And basically, this would lead you to try to reassess what is development and what do we want from it. In this particular sheet, this is a paper we published just recently, what we try to show is that on the x-axis you have privileged people and marginalized, and on the y-axis you have low contribution to the drivers and pressures of environmental degradation to high. And you find basically that the more marginalized you are and the lower income that you have, the less impact you have on the global environment, and the richer you are, the more impact you have, even if you're vegetarian, because of your pensions and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of a line like this. The birth rate is the only line which goes slightly differently, because if you are very marginalized, the birth rate tends to be higher. If you then look at who is suffering, then the more vulnerable you are, the more you are likely to suffer in existential terms. In dollar terms, it's possible that the rich suffer more because they have more to lose. So, and we have a lot of data that we took out of the Global Environment Outlook for this particular paper to illustrate this. So, the question is, how do we address these issues? Now, the SDGs talk a lot about partnerships and hybrid services and working more with private sector partnerships. And I think I want to make a case over here that such partnerships may be necessary, but may not actually serve the issues of the poorest of the poor. And who pays for such work and such services? Who is left with the debt? In what currency is that debt? How is that contract organized? And this is the famous Bechtel versus Bolivia case, where we look at the role of private sector investment in water. Who is going to address sanitation services for the poor without using a sanitation ladder? Why should the poorest only get a hole in the ground? Why can't they get a decent service which also cleans up the sewage? And why can't we as a society not be able to subsidize that? And I think that the NGOs also are unable to provide these services sustainably. And that is the reason I would go for trying to focus not just on the aid agencies. I have some critique on various aid agencies, and I can come back to that subsequently. But I think what we need to do is to make stronger states in the developing countries, more accountable states, states from whom you can demand that they provide public goods and merit goods. In this narrative, I'm afraid right now that we have a shrinking eco-space because the environment is getting more and more polluted. We have a contested social space as well as a growing, shrinking civic space in many parts of the world. Democracy is under threat even in the United States. And we have a manipulated political space. And so for me, it's really important that we move towards sharing our earth through hard and soft limits on ecosystems related issues, through promoting social inclusiveness through a range of options, but including human rights. And in relational inclusiveness, trying to rediscover the contract between humans and the state and the role of tax justice within this, and trying to ensure that the state is continuously going to provide us with street lights and that they don't become subject to an app that you pay for when you walk under the street light if you are rich enough, and which people are talking about. So in our storyline, we come to a discussion about access to resources, which is the minimum, and allocation of rights, responsibilities, and risks. And we argue that this would mean, for example, in terms of rights, it would mean tenure rights. It would mean liability and compensation in relation to people if they are damaged. We would look at whether technologies enhance access, whether we should not leave developing countries with stranded assets. Who in the world will be left with the stranded assets of oil if we all have to phase it out? Will it be us or will it be the South? How will we deal with that? So there are certain key elements over here with respect to how do we actually manage access to and allocation of rights, responsibilities, and risks in relation to ecological issues, in relation to social issues, and in relation to relational issues. Now, I can explain that better through this diagram. I argue that all countries will have to discover their own pathways to development, because we all need to find a low environmental impact development future. And that basically means that developed countries may not have the technologies to provide to the South. The South may have to rediscover its own pathway. And each of us have to figure it out, because we have to find the shortcut to sustainability. For developing countries and development studies students, I think it's really important that we not only look at the frames, the ideological power, the scientific power, in our narratives, in our research, but we also look at how this power translates within foras, and then look at how in that fora it leads to outputs. So how does the output reflect the power composition at the ideological level, and then go backwards from how does the output then affect the outcome and then the impact. So to look at all these levels and not just be either a scholar looking at discursive approaches or being a scholar looking only at instrumental approaches, but to try to understand the links between the two. And I'm going to end with my storyline about how do we interpret the SDGs in the Anthropocene. A minimal approach or a maximum? In a minimal approach, we look at individual goals and targets. Maximizing synergies is a little bit further down, minimizing trade-offs, and then putting the last first. And what this basically means is that the first part is the smooth transition, and the second part is disruptive transition. So if we really want to put the last first, that's disruptive. And very few governments are willing to talk about that. And my feeling is that as scholars, we have to sit at all the levels, because we can do our research and disruptive transitions, but when we are trying to communicate with governments or with policymakers, we may have to soften the blow. Otherwise, we will lose them before we even start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyeeta. We have the immediate next presentation, I would suggest, for burning questions. I do see a hand there.
Just a very short one. Nobody knew what is BES as an abbreviation. Sorry for that.
Sorry. BES. BES is biodiversity and ecosystem services. Okay. And nowadays it's called nature's contribution. Okay. So we can get away from that services and commodification.
Thanks for that clarification, and we can engage more in discussion once we're all on the panel. But I would ask Imme to proceed with her presentation straight away.
Thank you. So my presentation is much more narrow than Joyeeta's, and I think it's right that yours is the first contribution actually in the book, because when you lift such a big topic as Anthropocene and look at it from the perspective of inclusive development, I think that is a really challenging and provoking new combination of things. And I share much of your analysis and much of the conclusions you draw from it, especially the critique, the table you show with a critique from inclusive development towards this global approach, which is typical for Anthropocene studies, and also for one of the pictures I have in my presentation, which is, how do I move it? Yeah, this one. No? I mean, it's clear that this is very familiar, the planetary boundaries concept developed mostly by natural scientists, actually, by geologists. So people which look at very long time frames and actually are not so much interested in understanding the social practices which are creating this picture, and which vary so much across the globe and still have to be taken into account and understood when you want to do something, when you want to first understand how these trends have built up over time, and how they actually play out differently also across the globe, so the global and the local. Both in terms of causes and impacts, but also the social practices and power structures and in the different distributive relationships which are behind this, and not only in terms of how the impacts are distributed unevenly as well, but also how poverty and wealth are contributing to the causes. I think that is something which in India has been a lot of research done on that. I remember a paper by Lele really 30 years ago, trying to explain that it's not poverty which is the biggest polluter, but it's the lack of access to technologies, which is part of the problem, but also Ramachandra Guha, who put forward this, what you mentioned, the dependency of the poor on a healthy environment, actually, which is much larger than because of the lack of resources for buying themselves out of a destroyed or a degraded environment. But what I find very important when my topic was the relevance of environmental research for development studies, so a bit more narrow, because when you look at how the environment figures in development studies in master programs, for example, when you look at development masters, you see that there are many development masters where the environment still doesn't come up. What you have a lot is masters on environment and development. But a convergence between the two or overlap is very rare. What you then have when you look at social science or social science research on the environment, there is a proliferation of schools and disciplines. Nearly all disciplines cover it, and I say very shortly something about that in my text in the book. But you see that much is dealing with impacts of is in the overlap. Let's put it like that, between environmental justice and development, yeah, and a lot in framing also. So the frames, but combining the frames with what happens at the local level, I think, especially from the perspective of global environmental change, that is quite. I think that is an area of study which is still missing. But let me come back to my first slide. Some of my colleagues know it already. Maybe some of them know it by heart and are bored with seeing it. But I will still come back to it, because I think that it says in a way the same as you have said, but within the national containers. Yeah. So it also pictures where countries are located on the horizontal axis regarding the level of human development they have reached. So that refers back to the Human Development Index as published by the UNDP. And on the vertical, it connects this degree of human development with the global footprint associated with it. And the blue rectangle is where the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, would like to see us in 2030. Yeah. So this is as the normative description or summary of the 2030 agenda. But what we see today is that currently the patterns of society-nature relations dissociate human well-being from the well-being or the maintenance of nature. Yeah. So this is, I think, what we can state when we look at how countries are distributed across these two axes. Thank you. And what we see, the dotted lines are the available biocapacity per capita according to the Global Footprint Network, which can be criticized methodology, but it's just a proxy. And what you see is those countries which are below the dotted line pay the price of a low level of human development, while countries which have a high level of human development have various ecological footprints. So not all of them have massive ecological footprints, but some do. But all are above the dotted line. So that's why I say it's dissociated. Yeah. So the question, as you say, Joyeeta, is how to reach the rectangle. Yeah. And as this here shows, the patterns of environmental use and social and distribution of social benefits are so different that it is clear that the pathways to change, the pathways towards this rectangle, are also quite different. And what is terrible is to see that there are countries, if you see at the dotted, there you see some dots which have a high environmental consumption and still a very low level of human development. So that's really the worst of the worlds. Yeah. But obviously these dots up there with a high human development and an extreme environmental consumption is tragic as well. So these are the examples not to follow. what I wanted to say here is what you can get the impression that we are trapped in the Anthropocene. Yeah. My colleagues who work on flight and migration, they use the term of trapped populations. Maybe some of you read the Süddeutsche Zeitung today. There is a big interview with Benjamin Schraven on migration and climate change. And he explains the concept of trapped populations, which is used by migration scholars who say the poorest who are threatened by environmental degradation, which are threatened by conflicts, by extreme forms of exploitation, most of them are trapped in their countries. They don't even have the resources. They maybe can move within the country a little bit, but they are trapped in these situations. Yeah? But if we think about the planet and about humanity as a whole, what I fear most is that we are trapped in the Anthropocene. We are trapped in this pattern of disconnect, of dissociation between human society and nature. Yeah? Because human activity has these global geological effects, so we know how to do that, we know how to continue with business as usual. But our knowledge and experience with this disruptive change, as you say, we have little experience with that, especially at a planetary level or at the level of global society. So that is for me, the challenge of what I would describe as the challenge of development studies today. From the perspective of the graph I showed before, it is clear that change has to happen not only in developing countries, but is very much in the north. So so this actually requires us to rethink what we understand under development and also under inclusive development. So I think the big contribution of social sciences, but especially development studies from the social sciences to understanding the relationship between environment and development is exactly that it's the understanding of relations of justice and injustice in societies and how those affect the way natural resources are used, how the impacts of this environmental use, but also of the impacts of environmental change are distributed within societies, but also across societies. So this disconnect also between who is responsible for the causes, who feels the impact and who has to live with the impact, and also who is heard when decisions on the environment are made. So who has an influence on these patterns of environmental use and how the impacts are distributed. And so this is important to understand both within societies, but also how societies negotiate with each other and who is heard there. So I think this is a big contribution of social environmental research. And the difference I make here between, it's not mine, it's from David Schlossberg, between environmental justice and ecological justice. I just want to draw your attention to this differentiation because and I think you have made that point too, Joyeeta. It's not only about environmental justice among humans, between generations and with regard to future generations. It's also about justice regarding the relationship between humans and other species, other life forms. That's what I understand under ecological justice, and where I think that this area of rights is not considered. Maybe from an instrumental point of view, but not from a rights perspective, and you are a lawyer, and from a rights perspective per se. My last point obviously is exactly the same as yours. We can't understand global environmental change if we do not place nature-society relations in their local, in their historical contexts. There is no global approach really. The global approach is important to understand the interactions across history, but it still requires a very deep and thorough understanding of local patterns. So, and what I also would say is that it's not enough to have interdisciplinary research within the social sciences, across the social sciences. This is very difficult, I know that. It's not easy to have interdisciplinary approaches within the social sciences. It's also not easy to have that within the natural sciences, but we need bridge also the gap between natural and social sciences. But I think also if we want, so this is required for understanding. Now, if we want to change these nature-society relationships, we have to engage in what we call in Germany transformation research or transformative research. So research which focuses on understanding processes of transformation, but also either from outside or from inside, participating in these transformation processes. That's understood. That's how we understand transformative research. So being part of that as researchers, and that I think requires to engage with non-academic actors as well, and that's called transdisciplinary research, which is quite demanding in itself as well, because it requires quite different ways of working and discussing. And I think that a focus on international cooperation as such is required as well. And so this is my last one. So what does it mean if we want to make development studies fit for the 21st century? Yeah. And here maybe I should say, it really depends whether you talk about development studies here in Germany or whether you do it in an Anglo-Saxon context, because here in Germany we don't have this development studies as a discipline as you have it. If you, I read the beginning of your article, or also in the introduction, it said this development studies is per se a multidisciplinary thing. That's not the case here. In Germany you have development studies as a subsection of political science, of economics, of sociology. So that is a different approach. So it means it's not by definition multidisciplinary. You can cozily, comfortably remain in your discipline and still focus on what your discipline tells you development studies would be. But what I think is important for designing development studies which make sense in giving us the necessary knowledge resources for understanding transformation and for engaging it, the first one is reframing development. So the D in development studies. I think it requires to understand that we need concepts of human prosperity that are universal, so that different from what we understand under prosperity today here in Germany. That's probably not universalizable, if that's an English word, and within the Earth limits, which is a matter of knowledge, of hard factors, but soft factors as well, because the soft factors in this sense are how high do we want the probability of avoiding tipping points of change, for example, be? Yeah, how, and that is not set in stone. That is not a given. That is something which science has to can define on different levels and has to make clear to society where the negotiation limits are and what it means in terms of costs. I think what is very important, obviously catching up development is not an option anymore. So what does it mean if we say decarbonization is not only a need in Europe, but it's also a need for setting up universal access to energy services in African countries, for example? What does it require in terms of international support? What does it and international support, not only financially, but in setting up the knowledge systems and for devising such strategies. This is very much different from what we imagined, I think, when we talked in 1992 about the Agenda 21. I think the extent of change is much, much larger now. And so it actually requires you to get an understanding of how your local well-being is connected to global well-being and vice versa. And that has, of course, a lot of implications also for legitimate political decision-making. Our political systems are not adjusted to this requirement. Yeah. So the topics which I think are important are the three I mentioned here: transformation pathways, understand them, be able to design them. Scenarios are important for that. Focus on the distributive effects, that's your point with inclusive development. But also focus on the roles of technologies, markets, governments, citizens and their interactions. So that's more about regimes and governance modes. I think international cooperation is very important. I have a better understanding how the patterns of the regimes of international cooperation have to change to be fit for contributing to this transformation process, and this applies to their awareness of, from each policy field, understand how they are linked to inequalities as obstacles and as challenges to address, but also not to think of this being a matter mainly of North-South cooperation, but of cooperation among northern countries as well as southern countries. Yeah, and then that's why I put thematic cooperation across in it, because you can, why not think about coalitions, so to say, which are built for making progress in specific, like SDG 3, this is something where we have a coalition between Norway, Germany, and Ghana, where you have to test that, do our instruments we have for promoting international cooperation allow for such coalitions? And finally, just a point on inter and transdisciplinarity. I think this is a real task for development studies to build literacy in this respect. That we have, that we understand the limits of our own discipline and what it takes to be able to cooperate with other disciplines for overcoming these limits, and the same, how to engage productively with non-academic partners and not force them to just work within the patterns defined by academia, because that is would reproduce actually the blindness we as scientists have with regard to the practice-based knowledge non-academic actors have and the potentials they have to contribute to solutions. So that would be it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, making similar points, which does sort of facilitate the discussion, but it also means there's a bit more lesser controversy. Maybe the audience comes in. I'm trying to be a bit more provocative in the first question and see your reactions in that. You sort of both made the case, and Joyeeta made it very clear and the Anthropocene being criticized as being too big to cater for the local. Once we have a discussion that is so macro, meta discussion, how do we translate that into research? What are topics? I know in your chapter you've also outlined a couple of elements that we would have to think about, and then I'd like to push you forward a little bit more on that. But first, let us know a little bit more what you think as researchable topics that we should deal with in the area, the broad area of development studies.
Well, one of the things could be easily a local tipping point. So if you look at the Netherlands, for example, and I'm now talking about a developed country, we have had so much reaction because in Groningen the gas has been taken out and the houses are affected by earthquakes. So the local people are now fighting against the extractive industry in the Netherlands, and that has led to the government making a decision about gas and also phasing out gas. I mean, they've made a policy about how they're going to deal with gas. So I think that we need to have local tipping points in all parts of the world, because if you extract groundwater beyond recharge limits, you're going to see more, you're going to see the land collapse, you're going to see salt water coming into the groundwater systems, and you're going to see an inability to depend on the groundwater systems. So I think we need to have local tipping points, and that can be done contextually. It can also be based not just on the environment, but also on the number of people dependent on that ecosystem now and in 2050. So the way I visualize those ecosystemic goals that are being developed is that they're talking about the globe, and we try to develop them at the different scalar levels and bring it down to the lives of local people.
In much of the policy discussion, it's often seen as challenged by populists, feeling alienated because you have a large debate, a big macro debate that you cannot follow. You could also see that as a reaction of liberals, saying they come with a big debate and a macro debate, and individual freedoms are being reduced from the macro perspective. How do we engage with the big problems and big issues in a way that you can also communicate that to a local population?
So I'm going to take two answers to this. The first one, of course, is the systemic limits that apply to your neighborhood are relatively easy to do. But when you are trying to externalize the impacts of your behavior to people elsewhere in the world, and then you say, I'm not willing to not drive or whatever, I feel that is a challenge. So what we find, at least with the populist groups in some parts of the Western world, is that they do not wish to take responsibility with respect to the global problems they've caused and the impacts that have had that have led to perhaps displacement somewhere else in the world. And I think there the narrative has to be changed. We have to find a way to explain to these people that maybe if you one bottle of wine, if you sacrifice one bottle of wine, you could perhaps help one migrant for 10 months. I don't know, we have to think of clever ways in which to communicate a narrative that makes it manageable for them, but while still not letting them shirk their responsibilities in terms of the externalization of their damage. And I think that's where the state plays a role, because in the Netherlands, our governments allow us to externalize our impacts because they don't tax us. There's no tax justice from an environmental perspective or an ecological perspective, to use both terms.
One of the elements is the discussion in the north, or the second one I would say is the discussion in the south. You mentioned it in your presentation, saying there's no more catching up. What I hear very often in discussions is then the point of now you take the perspective of development away from us. Now that we are on a good path of catching up, we have economic growth, now you take the prospect of us ever reaching that point away.
Yes, sure, that is, that could be one interpretation of it, yeah. And that is what is a fundamental unfairness, actually, of the historical effect of these destructive patterns, but we can't discuss it away. It's we can't say, for a matter of justice, I want to allow for more catching up development. That is what I think happened for a long time in climate negotiations after 1992, that it was seen, well, first of all, the amount of emission reduction which was thought necessary in the north, or which was negotiated in the end, was clearly insufficient. And it suggested that if this reduction was achieved in the north, then the south could just go on with catching up development. So we lost a lot of time there. Yeah. And but now it cannot be ignored. I mean, some of the Fridays for Future are also in developing countries. They're standing there and saying, we want action now, and we want it, and they have to demand it from the north and the south. Yeah. But I think that it is clearer today that this is a universal responsibility. If you look at how the Paris Agreement and how the 2030 agenda are conceived, there you see it is all national governments which have to make contributions. Of course, it's not spelled out and quantified, yeah, but it's not quantified from a global perspective. It's quantified as bottom-up contributions, yes, voluntary contributions. But I think that this is the thing we have to face, and that, as I said, that's not the way the role of international cooperation is thought today. Yeah, it is also voluntary, but there is it is not negotiated globally, obviously, neither. Yeah. And I think I'm also quite skeptical about this leapfrogging approach. That's the other solution, which is sometimes thought that because developing countries don't have the carbon-heavy infrastructures today, they could immediately proceed to the carbon-light infrastructures. Yeah. I'm not completely convinced about that either, because that is very knowledge intensive. Yeah, because it means designing a system which nobody has designed yet. Yeah. So, and that's why I think that transformation research is so important, and not only transformation research which looks at the past, why is it so difficult to achieve better results, but also how could scenarios or pathways look like in the future. So like what the deep decarbonization pathways project tried to do. And there, in these scenarios, it is important to include not only to have as an objective not only mitigation requirements, but also requirements in terms of job creation, livelihoods, and so on. And that would be the for me the way to make it also understandable to society that they are not losing, but that they are gaining a perspective on the future for that.
May I come in with an anecdote? When we handed over the policymakers' summary to the governments for their approval, one of the points that we had made in our report was that meat production uses 70% of agricultural land, directly and indirectly, and is also responsible for greenhouse gas emissions and water use. So we had said something to the effect that if people in the Western countries would eat less meat, which is good for their health, it could also contribute to the global health. And the Latin American countries got very upset because now we can't even sell you meat, and we will, it'll affect our future. So there is a whole discussion about the fact that the rich countries are throwing away the ladder, so it's preventing the developing countries from catching up. But if I look slightly differently at the narrative, and I look at India, when I was growing up in India and you were traveling in a train, we used to have these mud cups, and you would drink your coffee in the mud cup in the train, and then you would throw it out the window, and the mud cup would collapse, and it would just be an unpolluted environment. I have not calculated the CO2 emissions in making the mud cup, but there were these local potters who made money, and there was a system. Today it's all plastic or aluminium, and it's littering the environment. So you could find stories in your own history. We also have something called the kabadiwala, the guy who comes to your house and takes all the old dishes and the old newspapers and recycles. Now, he doesn't earn very much, but if you could create a system by which this could become a viable part of the circular economy, it would change things a lot. A few weeks ago, I went to the dump at our own neighborhood in the Netherlands, and everyone is throwing away huge usable items, and it doesn't get reused. So India had these systems, and if India lets those collapse, then to recreate a circular economy later would be much more difficult. So to some extent, I think that they should find in their own systems ways that they respect, but also look for other alternatives, because I think the ultimate point at the end of this story is not whether India is able to catch up with the West or China is able to catch up with the West, but whether China has enough water for itself and whether India has enough water for itself. So the water budget will become the limiting factor, I think, for both these two countries.
That's rephrasing or reinventing the narrative
Yes.
of development. You also mentioned the linkage of research to policy making and how to provide input for transformative change. And you yourself also mentioned that we sort of have to soften the message. Does that necessity to think inside the box when you are engaging in the exchange between research and policy, does that limit
So when
us?
I brought up the issue of disruptive change, I think it was an EADI conference where the issue of disruptive change came up quite strongly. And when I brought this issue up to the policymakers at the Global Environment Outlook, they said, that's out of the scope of discussion. You can talk about transitions. Mm-hmm. And so we focused on transitions and transformations. But at the end of the whole process, I realized that when we were doing the answers to the press, they came up with the most interesting questions. They said, okay, can you tell us what's affordable in Africa? And we never did any research about what is affordable transformation in Africa. So we were just doing research based on what our national science foundations are willing to finance us. And they're not asking, this is affordable transformation in Africa is seen as a boring, old-fashioned topic, not cutting-edge, innovative. And so you don't get money for that kind of research. So I found that in most of the cases, the questions they were asking, we were not able to answer. And the kinds of solutions we were offering came like, okay, so how am I going to change the system? I'm only a Minister of Environment. If I go and talk to the Minister of Economics, he's going to laugh me out. So.
Plus, when you talk about disruptive change to policymakers, they immediately get scared.
They get very scared.
The point is reform, not disruption.
Yes, but if we stop eating meat, that's disruption in Latin America.
Thank you. I think that was a nice closing remark in pushing us and pushing society and pushing state actors as well as considering our own personal responsibilities. The book that you will see a copy of at the entrance contains this discussion. It contains discussions about different perspectives on knowledge. There are discussions there on power relations between different types of knowledge and societies. And I think it's a wealth of debates that you have for development studies and a lot of discussions that we have ahead of us as well in the Institute and in the community. Thank you both very much for the presentations and the very lively discussions. Thank you very much for joining us and for your contributions to the discussion.